Good evening, planet Earth. This is your host, Scoob, and for the first time, I am doing a recording on my own because I realized I had a booklet of topics and ideas that lent itself fairly well to being almost like a Reddit compilation list, or monologues you might see on YouTube, similar to what I'd been listening to on my own anyway. So if Matt Chrisman and Isaac Abrams can talk into a microphone by themselves, so do I. So can I, even though it might not work and it might be against my better judgment. What follows, I'm going to try to make short and sweet, but it's a compilation of ideas I've collected in a notebook over years now of various practical, pragmatic, and almost all of them pre-existing technologies to offset or mitigate the damage that humans are doing to the biosphere. Because my background is a biologist, and the elephant in the room with most nature documentaries and scientific and biologically minded people who have had that training and understand evolution is that the picture is probably far worse than we're even capable of imagining because of the scale of time. A lot of species that we still technically exist right now are doomed in the long run, because in the long run is infinite. So not only do you have to try to keep elephants and lions alive in Africa or Southeast Asia for the next 10 years, but for the next 10,000 and the next 100,000 after that, because there is no endpoint to evolution except extinction. So in previous talks with Muggs or Luke, I often come across as a pessimist, but please understand that this is a mass extinction and it's the end of the age of mammals. That's baked in and there's nothing we can do about it. And we have to start thinking in terms of mitigating the damage of industrialization and human impact at the same scale of industrialization itself. You almost have to have a countervailing anti-industrial effort, or else you'll make the extinctions even worse and the human impact even worse, and you'll end up with a scenario far worse and far more devastating than any pre-industrial existence. So if you think people in the 1700s had it tough before industrialization, think of how tough it would be in maybe 2700 AD, 1,000 years after that, when we've done what we've done to the biosphere. So I think three things will stick out. One is that most of them are not my own ideas. The vast majority are not. The second is that most of them are not very fancy at all. Many of them simply involve nothing more than moving certain types of rocks around, literally. And the third is that and very few of these technologies, and many of them are not technologies, they're simply practices, doing what we already know how to do, simply differently. Most of them cannot be bound and have intellectual property rights set around them. So nobody's set to be able to squeeze money out of these implemented ideas. They're simply things that we probably must do in order to survive as a species with some dignity. And nobody's going to make any money off of it. It doesn't fit into the current Western system, at least. So, unsurprisingly, I'm going to talk about the molten salt breeder reactors at first. And there you go. So, eat up the food chain of energy with molten salt breeder reactors, specifically the fast spectrum molten chloride breeder reactor, which is cheaper, more robust, and is able to use many more fuel types than some of the more delicate, fancier molten chloride breeder reactors. So, keep open the current fleet of light water reactors, which are solid fueled nuclear reactors, and hold on to their supply chain of high assay, low enriched uranium, because that high assay, low enriched uranium is going to keep them going, creating power without making carbon dioxide, while you're building and creating and rolling out, implementing this fleet of molten chloride breeder reactors. And the first place you put those molten chloride breeder reactors, you build them literally at the same site as a light water reactor, because it's already been permitted, certified, and it already has a group of people, operators who know how to work with nuclear stuff, and all the spent nuclear fuel, most of which is on site, is probably there, and after some cleanup and modification, you can use it as the spark to get your molten chloride breeder reactor going. So light water reactors, don't build any new ones, but finish the ones you've already started and permitted. Keep the supply chain of uranium and uranium mining going, because that's going to act as the kindling for your breeder reactors, and then build the breeder reactors and in factories and ship them first to light water reactors, and then the light water reactors will phase into molten chloride breeder reactors. You shut down the solid fueled section sensibly at the end of its lifetime, and you keep all the same steam generation equipment and all that, and even retrain all of your operators. You go to coal plants next, because they emit a lot of particulates and carbon dioxide, and you don't fire a single goddamn person. You go to the coal miners and you say, and the coal plant operators, and you say, nobody here is going to lose their job. If those of you who don't want to learn how to run a molten chloride breeder reactor or get retraining, you will still keep your job, even if it's sweeping the floor, because we're not here to punish working class people. A big reason our lower and working class people are so distrustful of maybe new science and maybe new anything that Wall Street or the system throws at them is usually the new systems are another form of enslavement. So coal next. Put the molten salt breeder reactors there on site, keep those steam turbines, and keep your same workers. And then, of course, bring in expert workers to actually, run it, those who aren't able to be retrained. Then you go to natural gas, because natural gas doesn't have as many particulates, and it emits less CO2. And then you divert the natural gas to chemical feedstock once you're no longer using it as thermal fuel. And then so you're eating up the food chain, right? From the most emitting coal and then to less natural gas. Once coal and natural gas have all been replaced, then you put molten chloride fast spectrum breeder reactors at hydroelectric plants and and then you would have to bring in steam to hook up to your dynamos, but the electricity equipment and infrastructure is already all there, right? So you don't have to build a new substation and transformers and all those things. It's already there. Build it on site in an ecologically sound way, and then once that's done, presumably all of your electricity is now generated from fission, molten chloride breeder reactors. And since they're breeder reactors, you only have to refuel them with about 3 kilograms a day of uranium or thorium or plutonium, and your electric grid is now carbon free. So you can ramp up the electric grid, and then you can start working on dam removal to restore natural flow in a sensible way. Obviously, don't blow it up and flood everything downstream, but in a sensible way, take down the dams, because they're one of the worst things you can do to your freshwater ecosystem. And your freshwater ecosystem is one of the most rare and valuable and potent in terms of ecosystem value of all ecosystems. There's a whole lot of desert in the world. There is not very much free-flowing river. There's 1,600,000 tons of depleted uranium sitting around in casks, most of it in the form of uranium, chemically bound as uranium hexafluoride, which is not only chemically toxic and radioactive because there's uranium in it, although it's not very radioactive. It's also very biologically active because it's so reactive. It's water soluble. It's hygroscopic. It absorbs water from the atmosphere. Those casks break and leak. It's a catastrophe. Thanks to the Cold War, we have to deal with that. So molten chloride breeder reactors on everything. Another thing to do is to put, while you're actually building the molten chloride breeder reactors, you also need to frantically build factories that are chemical factories that basically make methanol from the atmosphere. And these are well-proven technologies. The sulfur iodine cycle, I think there's an iron oxygen cycle. They are able to make methanol from the atmosphere, with carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at vast scales if they have a steady, high-powered, very high-temperatured heat source, hence your molten salt reactors. And they need to get to work ramping up very quickly to make millions of liters a day, like 93 million barrels of oil worth a day to, number one, help rescue humanity from peak oil, because the oil is depleting so quickly, it's destroying our economic futures very rapidly. It's happening in real time right before your eyes. And the other thing is, if you have all these factories every single day making 93, 94, 96 million barrels of methanol, and from methanol upgrading it to ethanol or diesel or whatever, drop-in fuels, they will be scrubbing that much CO2 out of the atmosphere every day, which would then get burned again, but that's okay. Because some of your, maybe 1 out of 10, 1 out of 20 of your molten salt breeder reactors need to be busy scrubbing permanently carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and injecting it into geological repository by chemically combining it with ultramafic rocks. Certain types of rocks turn to carbonate as they weather, and this permanently pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So, there you go. Now you've solved your fuel problem, you've solved peak oil, you've solved carbon dioxide removal, and you don't have to do any more mining of nasty things like coal and oil, except oil probably for chemical feedstock or natural gas. And the world is suddenly a much more hopeful place, isn't it? The estimate for cost for just the United States of using pre-existing solid-fueled advanced passive 1000 reactors to replace all coal, natural gas with those reactors in the United States was $6 trillion. But that was the estimate before the government started printing money to cover up for Wall Street losses, which is a different story. So these are not pie in the sky. $6 trillion suddenly doesn't seem like a whole lot of money. Okay. So, on a more happy note, along animal migration routes, birds and beasts, four-legged beasts, set up oases and feeding stations or boreholes for water along their migration routes to help them out. Also for butterflies and things like that, because the world has become a much more dangerous place for animals now that we're in it. And so it's maybe the least we could do. A lot of these migration routes are known. And if the animals had rest stops, so to speak, which that's what it is, you're giving them hospitality along the way, the attrition rates would be much lower. And the margin rate, some of these species, it's very marginal, and some of them really do need to migrate, like the butterflies, or they'll die out. And sometimes, one wrong turn or a storm in the face of a flock of birds migrating across the oceans, that might be the end of that flock if they get caught in a storm. So it's probably the least we can do, since we already farm a lot. We already produce a lot of excess food. I think the animals could do a little bit more, could use some. And it's very targeted. You're finding them at their most vulnerable and helping them out. It's not going to really screw up ecosystems, I don't think, but the science needs to work and look at it. Aggressive invasive species extermination on the islands where it can still work. Like, for example, invasive goats have really damaged the Galapagos. I've seen it firsthand myself. And it's trivial to think that any modern military wouldn't be able to deal with goats in a matter of weeks. I don't know. They might not win. I don't know. It might be real expensive. I mean, Australia lost the emu war. But and so maybe Ecuador, who owns the Galapagos, maybe their military can't deal with all those goats. I don't know, but I don't know. Maybe the soldiers maybe we could sacrifice a few soldiers and give some snipers some really good training and just kill the fucking goats or the rats on like South Georgia Island, things like that. Like those islands are very precious, very rare, and they're a once off. And it's not like there's not Big Goat Corporation. There's no equivalent of Big Tobacco or Big Oil saying no. There's not a secret. There's not a secret cabal of goat people in Washington, D.C. preventing the extermination of goats on the Galapagos and other places, Hawaii, things like that. So maybe we could make it happen. Or Big Pig, Big Wild Boar, that lobbying firm that really is going to keep the wild boar going. And the thing is even if you don't get everyone, reduce their numbers down very low and then just keep working at it. It's one big push and then it's a smaller push, presumably, for years afterwards. And if you actually exterminate them, you only have to do it once. Rats are more difficult, but even they can be done. It can happen, and we do have success stories. So don't listen to Big Wild Boar and Big Goat. They're liars. They're enemies of the people. They're enemies of the tortoises on the Galapagos. Here's a really shitty one. It'll kind of make your blood boil once you learn about it. A lot of fishing gear gets lost at sea, and it does something called ghost fishing, where you have a big long line net or a gill net that just floats around the ocean like a wall of death, and it catches and kills fish because it doesn't biodegrade, and it just catches them and kills them because it's not even attached to a boat anymore. And it happens a lot, and it's kind of the symbol of our age in a way, if you think about everything just kind of running on fumes. So replace fishing nets with high quality but biodegradable material. And yeah, it'll be slightly less tough, and yeah, you might lose a bit more of it, but at least it won't drift around for fucking decades, maybe less, killing your own fish. Like the people who should be the most for fish conservation are fishermen themselves. That's their, surely they could find it in their heart to have maybe an inconvenience by making the nets out of things like manila hemp or sea sal, which is kind of a cactus type plant. Well, it's a agave, jute, but high quality but biodegradable. So at least the net will return to the earth, the carbon cycle, and not just hang around like a zombie that doesn't even eat its prey. So do that. Longline mussel and bivalve farming. New Zealand had probably the most fabulous aquaculture outside of the Confucian world. Aquaculture, and even the fabulous mussel longline aquaculture, where they grow magnificent green lip mussels in their magnificent fjords, and they just hang out in the water because they're brilliant people, and they go, oh, wait a minute, if we do this, they don't get dirty, and we have significantly more space. So wherever the seas are rich enough to raise bivalves, especially because they filter the water without needing to be fed, wherever the seas are rich enough, do that. It'll increase the habitat. It increases the productivity that you can catch in it, and there's no downside. There's no downside at all. You're increasing very much so the habitable area. The mussels can only live in a narrow band if they're attached to the ground, to the seabed. They can't be up too dry, and if they're too deep, they get eaten by starfish. So they're only this narrow band. You grow them out in the open water on these floating long line things. My God, there's nothing to lose with that. Another thing with aquaculture, and this one is much more controversial, but we have anadromous and catadromous fish, and they're not all over. Well, most notably salmon, but also eels. Eels are catadromous, I think. They spawn in the sea and then move to freshwater. Maybe, with great caution, introduce those kind of species into ecosystems that they'd be well adapted to. And many biologists would be rolling over in not their graves, they're not all dead, but very careful about it. But there might be good reason to do it. Bring salmon to, I don't know, Patagonia. Or not. You'd have to be very careful, but it would potentially decrease the fishing pressure on existing wild stocks, and the downsides might not be as bad as we'd think. However, take it with an extreme note of caution. Introducing invasive species has a very fraught history. Things like shad are a filter-feeding fish that spawn in fresh water. They've been introduced to the West Coast and the Columbia River, and it seems that they've really helped the sturgeon population because they swim upstream, and then, well, I believe they die, and the sturgeon eat them. And so sturgeon populations have increased in the Columbia River, partly due to this increase of food. That doesn't put much pressure on the Columbia River itself because the fish are eating out at sea. Okay, so I have a background in experience in wastewater as well, and wastewater is an ecosystem on steroids. In some ways, you can think of it as the guts and kidney system of a city. And speaking of the Columbia River, one thing you might not want to think about in very long continental river systems is that all those cities, Spokane, Missoula, Coeur d'Alene, Sandpoint, they catch most of their nitrogen and their waste. I'll admit that. But the wastewater itself, in the case of Missoula, 8 million gallons a day, something like that, the final effluent goes straight back into the Clark Fork River with all the nitrate and phosphate that's dissolved in the water going into the river and putting a nutrient load on it. It's not very dirty in terms of bacteria and whatnot, but it is a nutrient load. And if you think of how many cities sit on that Columbia River, again, fishermen might be a little disturbed by that because all of Spokane goes in there too. So by the time the Columbia River reaches Astoria, reaches the Pacific, it's got all the effluent nitrate. The river has had to deal with that biological oxygen demand. So one thing cities can do is, instead of injecting their final effluent straight back into a freshwater ecosystem, one of our most precious ecosystems, just build a mile of pipe, turn the final effluent pump 90 degrees, and put that mile of pipe out somewhere in a depression on land and fence it off, and it will turn into a marsh on its own. Of course, it wouldn't be that simple, but in principle it is, because heavy nutrient-laden water rich in nitrate and a little bit of ammonia and some phosphorus and other goodies, is excellent feedstock for marshes. And marshes are something that the world needs more of thanks to human activities, draining them. It would simultaneously reduce nutrient loads on rivers, increase the amount of wetlands in the world, scoop a hole, put the pipe out over it. You wouldn't even have to plant native plants. They would find their way. And it would also filter the final effluent much better. You'd have to be careful not to pollute the groundwater, of course. You would not want to put it next to where you get your drinking water. In fact, as far away from it as possible. But the soil, the marsh itself, would act as a filter. The cattails and the ferns and algae that grow in the marsh are growing by incorporating nitrogen and phosphorus into their bodies, and then that feeds a whole ecosystem. It's far, far better than putting it into a river itself. This is one that, think of just how practical that is. Every city, once in the lifetime of a city, you have a public works program that's really not much more than making a couple miles of pipe. And then there you have it. And lo and behold, the rivers are healthier. Think of how practical that is. That's the point of all of these technologies. A lot of them aren't even technologies. Okay. Oh, speaking of, here's another one. It's a booklet. We had, I said we should make nets out of biodegradable material. We should make artificial kelp as habitat for places where maybe sea urchins are too abundant. or the bottom isn't right, that can be for hold fast for living kelp as habitat for sea fish in the sea. Or if it's too deep for natural kelp, you could simply weave long ropes or like broad, flat, kind of like ropes with little flaps on the side, like a kelp plant. Anchor it, tie it to a rock, and just sink it where you on a seamount or somewhere where you know fish need more habitat, where the ground is maybe very flat and monotonous, so nothing can hide. Plop it down and have it be floating there for a few years, and now the baby fish have somewhere to hide, and the productivity of the ecosystem goes up, and now there's more fish for us to eat. Don't we love fish? Okay, so in foggy deserts like the Atacama and the Namib, build where the fog rolls in, imitate the natural ecosystem with fog catching technologies like nets. Basically, they're big horizontal air nets that catch fog, and trickle that water into greenhouses so you can conserve it, and then you could grow a lot of crops in an area that is not only not very productive, it's almost sterile. It's so dry most of the rest of the year. And then you could, so there's a lot of sun, grow a lot of stuff in those greenhouses very effectively and ship them to markets, so that you could let some very good agricultural land that maybe was made from ecosystems like temperate grassland, let that convert back into wild ecosystems so we can actually help stop the mass extinction going on. 99% of all temperate grasslands have already been plowed up. Maybe let 5% go back to natural grassland in a sane fashion. Don't be chaotic about it, and offset that 5% loss of farmland by growing it in places like the desert, the Atacama or whatever. And speaking of which, you could also in the Sahara or northern Africa, the Mediterranean shore, where it's very barren, you could put molten salt breeder reactors or solar desalination technology to grow things in greenhouses. Do desalination use seawater, sell the salt, or throw the brine back in the sea, and grow a lot of veggies in your greenhouse there very efficiently. They're in a greenhouse, so it's nice and warm, maybe too warm, and use water from the sea. And so that would also allow you to offset loss of more fertile land in places. But we can lose 5% desert because there's so much of it. And losing 5% desert is not nearly as much of a loss as the gain of getting 5% of your temperate forests back, because most of the temperate forests have been destroyed, but not much of the desert has been destroyed. So yeah, you might lose a little bit of desert habitat. Number one, there's not a whole lot there, and desert animals are no, less valuable than any other animal. But your lizards and snakes and kangaroo mice that live in the desert and then lost that little section still have millions of acres of desert elsewhere. You're not going to do much harm. Speaking of fisheries, initiate huge roe, egg, and sperm, roe and milt collection in fisheries like salmon or others, and do a breeding program so that you don't screw up the genetics of the species. Fishing can really cause a species to evolve, usually in a way we don't want. When you're especially when you're intercepting all the breeding adults, like a salmon run. You're taking all the good ones, and the ones who had the fitness to even make it that far. So maybe if you can, collect a diverse amount of their roe and milt, and have captive breeding programs, essentially the equivalent of kind of almost domestic species, but maybe do it right in such a way that you would imitate to the best of our ability how they would do it in the wild. So wouldn't that be nice? Okay, so oak forests in Western North America. The band of temperate forests. There's a lot of oak species in the Old and New World that maybe, and here again, it's invasive, so be careful. Diversify the number of species in oak forests, especially in Western North America. We only really have like the Gary oak and a few others. to extend the mast season, the number of months of the year that acorns are dropped to help feed animals and stuff, and maybe give them truffles as well. So in Egypt, here's another one. Not forests at all. We're back to deserts again. There's a depression in Egypt called the Qattara Depression. It's very deep. It's where a lot of the World War II battles were fought. Not in the depression, north of it. And the idea has been around for almost a century or more of building either a tunnel or a canal, because it's below Mediterranean sea level. Build a tunnel or canal into it, flood it with seawater, but slow enough so that it evaporates at the far end, because it's enormous. It's hundreds of square miles. And put a hydroelectric dam running on seawater, a big turbine, make some electricity, and then it would make a big saltwater marsh out in the desert. And it would also be a way to kind of offset sea level rise, because that's going to be something affecting all of us. And since while we're at it, talking about the Qattara Depression, that's one of the biggest below sea level parts of the world. But there's some in Djibouti, the country at the Great Rift Lakes, the Great Rift Zone of Africa. There's others in Tunisia and Algeria, and a few other parts, the Southern California, the Salton Sea, the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea is drying up very quickly because they're pulling too much water out of the Jordan. So Dead Sea is already salty, and so the idea is put a pipe with maybe a turbine on it. The water flows downhill. You can harvest that energy, and then it'll also refill some of these salty areas, and it would help with sea level rise a little bit. And as a world confronted with steady sea level rise of just year after year, it's a long, slow unfolding disaster. And so suddenly the funding would be found. The frantic sense of like, oh no, every year it's flooding. The tides get a little bit high tide is a little higher each time. People would start to get desperate and look at very serious ways to mitigate it. And one of the easiest is, there's a below sea level area. That's now prime real estate. So Egypt could look at the world and say, hey, we need help with our economy. You better fucking cough up the money to help us with this project, so that you can keep farming in Holland for a little while longer, or Florida. So there's our sea level rise. We've worked on that. So speaking of hydroelectric plant removal and freshwater ecosystems, a lot of these big inland seas, especially in like Central Asia, the Aral Sea, Lake Balkhash, Lake, not the Issyk-Kul, that's the Ili River, and the Colorado River Delta, these magnificent rivers in dry spaces that were so stupidly and short-sightedly dammed, because, hey, if we had water for irrigation, we can grow a lot of crops fairly cheaply and easily for export. And so let's do it. Let's dam the Colorado. Let's dam the Oxus and the Jaxartes, or now they're the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya. Let's dam the Ili River and there's others, to grow cotton in Uzbekistan, and it's a catastrophe. So if you put molten salt reactors, like earlier mentioned, on those hydroelectric plants so you don't lose the electricity, but you have to let it go. I don't know what else to say. If we lived in a more equitable and just world where institutions didn't compete against each other and there wasn't a competitive international environment, then a place like Uzbekistan, which would lose all the revenue and the employment from growing all that cotton because you dammed your river, hopefully through deliberate, intelligent programs, you could offset the economic damage that could do, because there is no free lunch. Yes, Uzbekistan grew a lot of cotton, but 40,000 fishermen on the Aral Sea were put out of work and destroyed. So you can't say that it was a net good, or that it was, the right choice to make. Not if you're one of those fishermen. And the Aral Sea is like one of the world's biggest ecological catastrophes. It's essentially dried up completely. We destroyed an inland sea, and we're continuing to do so. You can read about, I think it was Among the Green Lagoons by Aldous Aldo Leopold. I've read it. About the Colorado River Delta, which the United States destroyed by damming the Colorado River. There were jaguars in Southern California growing among these magnificent mangrove lagoons of the Colorado River Delta, a delta in a desert. We killed that. You cannot say that it was worth it. Or you cannot at least let the argument lapse. You have to tell me that it was worth it to kill the Colorado River Delta so that we could grow a lot of alfalfa in California. You cannot tell me. You have to actually make the argument. You can't just let bygones be bygones, because it's not. It's still not bygone, and we're still dealing with the consequences of that. And those dams do not last forever. So there's always losers as well as winners. And if you had molten salt reactors in places like Uzbekistan, you can maybe look at things like desalination or atmospheric water capture more seriously to maybe keep a lot of your irrigation going. So there's a type of rock, ultramafic rocks, that are very rich in things like magnesium and potassium. These are the same rocks. These are the rocks I mentioned that capture CO2 when they weather, when they're exposed to weathering. They chemically combine with it. They also act as reasonable fertilizer. They will help recharge tropical soils. So you take those rocks, because we know where they are. They're rocks from the mantle, not the lighter parts of the Earth's crust. And you grind them up, you pulverize them, and you throw them on tropical soils, and suddenly those tropical soils, like Brazil or in Africa, are a lot more fertile because they have more minerals, because most of the minerals are usually washed out by tropical rain. Do that, and you'll also help absorb CO2 out of the atmosphere. And speaking of that type of rock, those rocks also are basic. When they are weathered in seawater, they make it less acidic. And an enormous amount of our carbon dioxide that we've emitted, thanks to industrialization, has gone chemically into the seawater and made it more acidic. This is a very real problem. If it gets too acidic, you'll basically kill the ocean. Cell-forming organisms, things that need shells, there's a lot of those, stop being able to make their shells, and then they die. And then the entire food chain of the entire ocean collapses. So if you think overfishing is a problem, ocean acidification is something you need to think about. And a very simple study was done years ago looking at grinding up these, and they're not common, but they are abundant. I'll say that. There's plenty of them because the Earth is made out of rock. If somebody did a very simple study looking at how quickly the rock breaks apart and dissolves in seawater, especially if there's a lot of wave action and tidal action, and how it chemically changes the seawater. And he made the estimate that if we ground up and put 7 cubic kilometers of this rock into the oceans, the whole fucking ocean, every year, we would offset the acidification that our fossil fuel use creates. That's a lot. That's about equal to all the mining stuff we do already, but we already do that. So it's not impossible. This is not nuclear fusion. This is not a hypothetical thing, and there's nothing fancier to it than finding rocks where we know where to find them, scooping them up, grinding them in just fucking, rock crushers, and throw it in the ocean. Put it in big boats that are crossing the sea to pick up goods from A to B, and when they're there, dump it in. Big dump truck ships. And if you do that, you will have, you can then take responsibility for what you've done. Okay, so... since we've really reduced the population of whales, thanks to whaling in the 1800s and 1900s, got to get that oil. We've probably screwed up the deep sea ecosystems a bit because there'd be less whale falls every year. So all those decomposing critters that form that magnificent little mini city built around one dead body. They're probably hurting evolutionarily, and so maybe we should. This is grotesque, but take a bunch of like dead cows, downer cows, or some of the livestock that we have that needs to be culled or whatever, or animals that are too old to be slaughtered, and then humanely slaughter them, of course, captive bolt stunners, but like tie them all together and sink them to the deep sea to help feed those decaying organisms to help keep the deep sea going. Not so many like fuck things up, but I think, the point is obvious. It doesn't really need to be elaborated on, but we've reduced some whale populations by over 90%. And so you go from a situation where, if there's a population of 1 million humpback whales, and the death rate is 1% a year, that's 1,000 dead whales sinking to the deep sea every year before humans. And if you reduce it to, some of the whale populations are down to the hundreds, unfortunately. Speaking of the doomed. So the biomass going to the deep sea is probably significantly decreased. So we need to take responsibility for that too. Oh, speaking of the sea, you could do beneficial fish aggregator devices, maybe floating fish shelters. Think of it as the equivalent of a birdhouse for fish out in the ocean, in the open. I mean, you could do it. You should. Another one of these is to make rock fish houses for sinking, for benthic fish on the bottom, fish that need shelter. But out in the open, obviously, the pelagic fish doesn't do them much good. But you could maybe, out of biodegradable materials, make like floating rafts with the artificial kelp dangling down, floating across the Pacific like a Kon-Tiki, but it's uninhabited, and it would provide homes and shelter and egg-laying surfaces and food for all these fish. And you can see in like Blue Planet videos, rafting stuff does tend to gather the fish. You'd have to be careful. You're actually increasing or helping the fish, not just scooping them up, so to speak. But I think that would be really cool. And a really cool thing is you could build them if you made them fairly large, even just like 4 foot by 4 foot, with dangling rope kelp, down out the bottom, like sargassum, like seaweed. You could do that, and you could also put a scoop of dirt on it and plant a red mangrove on it, or like the mangroves that can survive in saltwater, and just it'd be like a little flower box, a little forest box floating across the ocean. You could leave notes in them like, hello from South America, hello from Peru, and they would pick them up in Polynesia or Indonesia. It might very well increase the productivity of the seas if you did it at a significant scale, because it might increase the amount of flying fish that are able to survive and others, Another thing it might do is actually provide a place to rest for seabirds. It seems trivial, but it might not be. You'd be surprised how often things like habitat are limiting factors in ecosystems. Like, one reason woodpeckers are successful is that they're able to make their own home whenever they want. And that, believe it or not, sometimes, if you look at the energy amount in an ecosystem, you could have more of certain species if they had more homes, if they had more places. You never know. Okay, so next on the list, you could, in the temperate forests, you could coppice trees intensively, because they grow very quickly afterwards. This is how they kept forests going, but also harvested wood in like the Middle Ages. So for broadleaf plants, alder, maple, things like that, to make a lot of charcoal out of it, biochar, which sequesters carbon. Use those basically as plantations. I'm not talking about primary like virgin forest. I'm talking basically about plantations of coppice stuff to stimulate new growth. It's a good way to get a lot of growth very quickly in a forest. For poor parts of the world, that still rely a lot on wood for cooking, build and give away stoves that do not burn all the way to ash, pyrolysis stoves, biochar stoves. So you put wood in there, you get it going, and then you'd seal it up. It'll still emit a lot of heat and a lot of smoke, which you would pipe back through, of course, capture the smoke, ignite the smoke, and then strongly encourage them, but, be like, hey, if you're going to accept this free stove, please bury the charcoal instead of burn it again, even though many will, of course, use the charcoal. But that's okay. They still got their free stove, and it's better than nothing. Here's one. Bring back the steppe nomads. We raise a lot of meat in factory farms, in confined animal feed operations, beef, chickens, well, not chicken, but especially the ungulates. Anything that ruminates, your goats, sheep, and cows are the main ones. Try to get them back on natural grassland and bring back a modern version of steppe nomadism where, yeah, it's a guy on horseback living in a yurt still, and he's moving around thousands of cattle and sheep and goats and milking them, and he's using dogs to do it, but also satellites are telling him where his lost cows are because they all have RFID chips in them, something like that. And he's on horseback, but he also has, his smartphone, her smartphone. It would relieve pressure on better agricultural land that's much better suited towards growing plants for people rather than growing like corn that you're then feeding to beef in confined operations. You're putting the hooved animals back on the steppe, grassland that we can't utilize, for other purposes. Humans obviously can't eat grass, and a lot of that grassland is so marginal you would never ever want to plow it up to grow wheat on it, and you'll get yourself another dust bowl. So it would be a good way to make meat more expensive so that people eat fucking less of it. And it would be a good double whammy. It would bring back productivity in areas that are a lot of times empty at this point, and also relieve pressure on the existing farmland we have left because as sea levels rise, we're going to lose about 25% of our farmland, and it's some of our very best farmland, stuff near sea level. And so you'd build like refrigeration train, you'd build like high-speed rail trains out onto the steppe, and the nomads would come in, and the trains you'd do all your slaughtering there, and you'd have freezer and refrigeration facilities, and it'd be pretty cool. Okay, so restore the Nile River Delta and the flood cycle. Replace the Aswan High Dam with molten salt reactors so you keep the electricity. But yeah, you got to bring that back. The Nile Delta is sinking and dying. It was a bad idea to put the dam in place, and I'll stand by that. I mean, I understand that removing it would also be very problematic, but Egypt was the grain grower of the universe for millennia, and they put the dam in there, and now they have to import fertilizer. They have to pump the water around, and I do not believe that we are not so trapped in 20th century thinking that we have to use 20th century technologies. Yes, it would be problematic to bring back the flood cycle, but you could do it. The Egyptians are a smart, resilient, beautiful people. And if you did it smart, and I mean modern techniques, yes, the flood is coming, but you don't have to do it with the ancient Egyptian technology. You could have modern pooling systems and irrigate and channelizing systems, and bring in aquaculture when the water goes up, and then you raise a bunch of carp in the ponds, and then the ponds are full of fertilized water, and then you harvest the carp and then drain it down into the fields when you need it. Store it out in the desert. I don't care. Don't tell me it's not possible, because the dam itself was a bad idea, but it was considered impossible for a long time. And the dam is a primitive technology. Dams are a bad idea. They are primitive. They are foolish. It's a way of just kicking the can down the road and saying, fuck it. this is easiest at the time, and I'll get a more immediate payback, return on investment. No, the long-term damage is too great. Restore the swamps in Iraq, the mouths of the Tigris and Euphrates, the Sundarbans, that's the mouth of the Ganges. Restore those. Dump limestone and aragonite to the calcite depths. Skip that. Yeah. Wildland, rewilding parks as prestige and rewards to elites. If you can, if we have time, and we don't have much time, have rich people sponsor some of these species. It's really interesting to see our leadership wringing its hands. You'll see some rich person or an actor wringing their hands over the loss of something, when in fact somebody who's not even all that rich by rich person standards, let's say Taylor Swift, could essentially sponsor the North Atlantic right whale. There's less than 400 of them. They all have names. She could probably pay to have $1 million for every one of them. Pay $1 million per whale, and now that's her whale, so to speak, and she's hiring, I don't know, 24-hour protection or like a satellite program to keep track of them, or whatever, or to avoid collisions with boats because it's in a busy seaway. And now she, as a prestige item, is the savior of at least one species, instead of this kind of vague hand-wringing that doesn't seem to go anywhere, and it certainly hasn't helped. We're still on a downward spiral trajectory. Yeah. Oh, there's floating mangrove forest. I did that one again. Restore the Mississippi Delta. Let the Atchafalaya River, it wants to go down the Atchafalaya, and the Army Corps of Engineers fucked up the flow so badly for the sake of shipping that the sediment is just ejected way too deep at the sea. You have to change it so that you have a natural delta there again. Can you do coppicing on mangrove forests? Because they can use, the habitat mangroves grow in is usually fairly marginal, mudflats and things. Maybe you could coppice them at a limited level, turn the wood into biochar, and let them see if they grow back quickly or not. I could be completely wrong about that. They might be very delicate plants. Because they live in a marginal environment, they might not have anything extra. See if you can expand the Irrawaddy Delta. It's an incredible rice growing region, but there's a lot of sediment coming down. See if you can't maybe use like the Dutch or like the South Korean technologies of walling off, making polders, walling off an area from the sea and letting fresh water flood in and the silt build up. And so you're expanding land out into the sea at the mouth of a river, where you're putting all that silt, you're helping nature build land. It would do it anyway with the silt deposition. You're helping it along. It's one of those ones where human and natural interests may be kind of combined, because you could do the inverse of that. Maybe in Holland or Bangladesh or in other places where they do have polders, where they are expanding arable land because it's very fertile. You maybe also want to expand it a little bit just to make a mud flat, just for the seabirds and just for the wildlife. And maybe even sacrifice one or two, let the sea come back, because those mud flats are incredibly important, especially for birds. They're incredibly productive. They're all full of worms and clams and invertebrates and stuff. South Korea, among its islands, also has done some really interesting stuff with that, and keep some for people because it's new, but also maybe let nature have one or two. Especially if it's along migration routes, like I was talking with the rest stops for the birds. Okay. Some of the molten salt reactors, maybe 1 out of 10, be devoted just to scrubbing CO2 out of the atmosphere. Here's one that I thought would be neat, and then I was completely wrong about. Elevated holdfasts for kelp, so urchins can't reach. Big sea kelp, which is very valuable ecologically, is very vulnerable to sea urchins. It nibbles their roots. They're not technically roots, they're holdfast. And then the whole damn thing floats away. So I thought, well, maybe if you could attach by like strings or wires rocks for kelp to grow to that are elevated above the seafloor, so the kelp is still there, but the urchins are looking looking up, and they can't get to it because urchins can't swim. And it turns out urchins are incredible climbers. They can climb up like a wire, like a piano wire, with their little tube feet. So even if you did that, the urchins would probably find a way, but it might be worth looking at. You maybe could do it. And this brings up biorock. They're unrelated. This is coral now, but it turns out scientists have looked at, if you take ferrous metal, something that conducts electricity, put it in seawater and apply a very low voltage current through it, minerals from the sea will actually precipitate out onto it. And it's kind of looks like coral. And even better, if you attach living coral to that metal, like just literally tie it there sometimes, with like a wire, it seems that the current, far from harming the coral, the little polyps, it actually helps them grow their skeleton. And so coral reefs being very important and very vulnerable, like the Great Barrier Reef is dead. And you could have on a massive program to build, it looks like rebar. In fact, sometimes it is. And rebar structures, tie living coral to it, and then plug an underwater battery to it to run off on maybe solar. Maybe you could do it that way, or just have a long battery life. And it'll help accrete the mineral onto that, and you're helping the coral rebuild itself. It's fascinating and worth looking into. And you could do that with recycled metal as well. You could put a cleaned out, no oil in it, like a car or like old fencing or something like that, stick it underwater, tie some corals to it, put the electric current through it, and then it eventually looks like natural rock again, as long as it's not in too bizarre a shape. So that's cool. The polders. So up in the north and the south, where the ice is, maybe on a massive scale, build pumping stations to pump sea water during the winter, especially, up onto land or ice flows to thicken the ice. Because if we could very well within 10 years lose all summer sea ice in the Arctic. Not land ice, but sea ice. And when that happens, it's a positive reinforcement loop, especially. It gets warm water, the water warms up faster. So the unthinkable it becomes thinkable the moment it happens. And so maybe during the winter, send ships up there with big pumps, or maybe drill a hole through an ice flow with a pipe down into the water, and the pipe is hooked up to a pump, and the pump is hooked up to an engine, and it pumps water up and sprays it onto the surface of the ice flow at a rate that won't sink it, I assume, so that it freezes, and you thicken the ice, maybe quite a bit. It seems crazy, but look at irrigation schemes, look at sprinkler systems in deserts. We're going to have to start thinking on this scale, or else nature will do it for us. If we don't take responsibility for the Arctic sea ice, nature will push us in some places tens of kilometers inland with the rising sea levels, and nature doesn't need your permission to do that. So yeah, wouldn't that be interesting? Or strangely enough, I mean, on land, if you're an island next to Arctic water, maybe during the winter, I mean, it seems crazy until you've worked in like wastewater like I have, where 1 million gallons a day is nothing. Easily the city of Tacoma could treat 80 million gallons of wastewater a day. Well, build a mile or two of pipe up onto some island somewhere where the geology is favorable, and pump 5 million gallons of seawater a day onto some barren island and build a glacier. And if you do that several hundred times, maybe you're getting to the point where you can essentially create ice caps on your own in order to help regulate sea level. along with, of course, your Qatar depression and these other things. Because if the sea rises, um, okay. Non-specialty plastics, food storage, bags, etc., wrapping, the basic not plastics that don't have to do anything specialized or withstand a certain temperature or something. Your containers, the plastic we interact with on a daily level, not medical grade things or whatever like that. You can build very similar materials that technically aren't plastics. Celluloid is a pre-modern era. Well, it's a cellulose-based plastic. And there are other chemicals like it. They are biodegradable. So at least minimize the amount of plastic. All plastic that doesn't have to be made of plastic out of something non-biodegradable for specific reasons, make it out of things that are biodegradable. People will kick and scream. I don't care. Like, no, we're not going to have cling wrap that is going to stay in the environment and do damage for centuries. No, you're going to have wax paper. Wax degrades, so does paper. Things like that. We have to integrate our economy into the ecology of the planet almost as much as possible, at least with materials that we interact with on a wide scale. So if you're going to make a lot of something, it has to be biodegradable. Or things like metal or ceramic or glass that is never, if you make ceramic, it's still a stone. So industrial fertilizers, superphosphate, nitrates, ammonium nitrate, potassium, NPK, the big three. When you make them, steep them like a tea bag, steep it in biochar first so that you don't get as bad of runoff. Like they make the superphosphate, our whole species relies on, we have so many people now and we use our fertilizers so profligately that we have turned them into a non-renewable resource. Great. Good job. So if you soak them, however long it takes to get a certain amount, 80 or 90%, bound to the surface, adsorbed to the surface of biochar, then you'll have less runoff. Then you have to use less of it. So there's less pollution, and you need less of the fertilizer, and the charcoal itself is an excellent soil amendment by itself, even if you don't soak it in that. So do that, people. New Zealand, Japan, Hawaii, Iceland, really volcanic places. Try to go full geothermal if you can, even though if they had molten salt reactors, you don't really need to. Also, they have a lot of fresh basalt, and basalt is one of these rocks that combines with carbon dioxide when it weathers. So go geothermal and then use your molten salt reactors to scrub CO2 and inject it into the basalt. Oh, speaking of wastewater, which I wasn't, but all non-recyclable paper goes into anaerobic digesters. So we make a lot of paper. It's cellulose. It's carbon. Instead of throwing it at a landfill, which is dumb, just pulp it up. Just run it through a pulper again. Turn it back into a sludge and inject it into an anaerobic digester. It'll be a slight energy source. You'll get a little bit of methane out of it, but more importantly, it's as the soil conditioner, quite honestly. Anaerobic digesters make good fertilizer and soil conditioner when you pump the sludge out. So, restore the Indus Valley, the Rann of Kutch, another river restoration. Huge plantations of cheap coppice, fast growers like alder and poplar. Alder nicely fixes nitrogen out of the atmosphere, which is good. Low input, but it's efficient, Yeah. Targeted trophic shifting in Grand Banks and other overfished areas to restore the cod or the like. Ooh, wouldn't that be interesting? Like a military campaign, basically go in and try to shift the, and this would be really cool, but very difficult. But the Grand Banks used to be full of cod they're still very productive, but the cod were fished out. Basically, the Canadians fucking sucked all the living fish out of the fucking sea. Well, there's still all this primary productivity. The sea is still very rich, but now there's no cod to eat it. They were replaced trophically by skates and the shark type thing, the kind of like a ray, and lobsters and other fish. So maybe, and we need a lot more wisdom. It'll be a few centuries before we're able to do things like this, but go in like a military campaign and be like, okay, over the next 3 years, we're going to jumpstart the cod again. We're going to do a breeding program or something, maybe have a lot of cloned cod, or like maybe cod that you've raised. And you go and you eliminate all the skates and the lobsters that eat all the baby cod, and then you throw a bunch of adult cod in there, and maybe in one colossal effort, shift an ecosystem back towards something that's arguably better. At least for people. And that seems so insane until you realize that's what we do all the time, inadvertently and unthinkingly. We do it all the time anyway. A good example of that is there used to be a sardine fishery in the Eastern Mediterranean. They were fed by the plankton that fed on the nutrients that came from the Nile River. Well, they built a dam across the Nile River. Now the water coming out of the Aswan Dam has had all the nutrients filtered out because it settles down in Lake Nasser, the lake, upstream from the dam. And so the sardines went away. Well, did anything eat the sardines? Pretty sure. So we already do that. All right, that's enough. Every technology in here has already been proven. The first molten salt reactor was built half a century ago. Most of them are not even technologies. Some of them are little more than putting a 90-degree bend on a pipe for final wastewater effluent. And I think the final note to say about it is people are very sure. People have already made up their mind on what counts as too expensive and what doesn't. We contemplate changes and undertakings far more expensive than many of these ideas every day, every day of the year. And we do things on an ecosystem scale that are far more disruptive than anything I said here, even though some of them are suspect and some of them should maybe be discarded. Maybe you really shouldn't put in extra oak species in Western North America. But we already do fantastically worse things as a matter of course. And because we're already simply used to them, it's accepted. So when we contemplate $1.5 trillion spent on the F-35 jet, which violates basic military axioms of if you have a weapon that's too expensive to use, it's not a weapon. If it's a weapon you can't afford to lose a single one of, then it's not a weapon. So $1.5 trillion goes into a black hole that's an airplane. But I guarantee you many people would look at some of these ideas and say that they are too expensive and too costly and we shouldn't consider them. I would counter that by saying, how expensive do you think ocean acidification might end up being? How expensive do you think, in around dollar terms, might a meter rise in sea level be? How expensive do you think ocean acidification, the collapse of all oceanic ecosystems would be if there's no more sea life? How expensive do you think it would be that many of the practices that would be eliminated, like the hydroelectric dams, they get old anyway, and they either need to be repaired or dismantled anyway. So what's more expensive, letting dams get old and fail, or biting the bullet, taking a deep breath, and then taking responsibility for what we've already done and what we've inherited from our ancestors? So there you go.